Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention next to a question I haven't asked you for years, and I wish I didn't have to ask you again, but British military deployed to base in Helmand after claims that the Taliban is now in control of around 65% of the area. Do you know that over 100 British soldiers died on that battleground and spent 4 years fighting furiously to keep it secure up until about 2010? 456 UK military personnel killed during the Afghan campaign, more than a quarter of them in that corner of the country. How do we persuade ourselves, how do we cling to the belief that they didn't die in vain? And this is the tough bit, all right? Maybe we can't. Maybe we can't.
So British military advisors have been urgently deployed to southern Helmand in Afghanistan after reports that insurgents have seized most of the strategic town of Sangin. It is where 106 British soldiers lost their lives, almost a third of all the UK personnel who died in the Afghan war. The province is just one part of a country where the Afghan army, organised and funded by the West, is increasingly hard-pressed, as our chief correspondent Alex Thompson now reports.
Fighting even around Lashkar Gah, the capital of Helmand province. Reports differ, but there is no doubt that insurgents have at least come close to ousting the Western-backed Afghan army from the town of Sangin.
We are assessing the situation and sending supplies to the security forces. If there is any failure, then the Ministry of Defence, the Interior Ministry, the National Directorate of Security and Security Council have a special agenda to solve it.
Well, they'd better have one. This is now a military and political crisis for Afghanistan and NATO. Things got so bad, a key Sangin official put his career on the line and took to Facebook on Sunday, writing to the Afghan president.
I know that bringing up the issue on social media will make you very angry, but Helmand stands on the brink. 90 men have been killed in Garesh and Sangin districts in the last 2 days.
Tonight, the strategic road to the Kajaki Dam from Sangin is cut. So too routes to other key centres across Helmand province. Now, in some respects, the NATO-funded Afghan army has been more resilient than some expected, but its casualty rate is up 27% on last year. Bombed, rocketed and sniped from Herat in the west to Jalalabad in the east, Kandahar in the south to Kunduz in the north. British military and political leaders who insisted for years the Afghan army was up to the job now seem to be washing their hands of it all.
We've not failed in our mission in Afghanistan. What we set out to do and complete our operations by the end of 2014 was to leave a sufficiently secure Afghanistan so that the Afghans then got control of their own country and could look after their own country themselves, which is why we worked hard to train up the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police. We gave them an opportunity. It's been up to them what they've made of that opportunity.
Sangin, where 106 British soldiers were killed in 13 years of war. Britain's third war in Afghanistan proved yet again mission impossible. Now the Western armies, who failed to dislodge the insurgents, advise the new Afghan army they've invented, who, if not also failing, are certainly hard-pressed. 10 British advisors have flown now to Helmand to advise the Afghans, but they're miles away from the fighting. US and UK special forces also reportedly there, likely rather closer. It all leaves those back in the UK who lost their sons in Sangin to reflect.
We went in there with inadequate numbers. We went in there with inadequate resources, and above all, we didn't have an exit plan, and we didn't have a definition of what victory or success would mean. Under those circumstances, we were almost going in there to find out what the problem was.
And Helmand, of course, just one problem in warfare across the country. This year, insurgents briefly took over an entire Afghan province in the north, Kunduz. Yesterday, in Parwan province, they killed 6 US soldiers, the deadliest attack on NATO since August. And all the while down south, across Helmand, the upsurge in fighting continues, with the attempt or actual seizing of Sangin, and fighting also in the regional capital Lashkargah, once one of the calmest places in Helmand. So a whole slew of factions now fighting the Afghan government and NATO, from the established Taliban groups, and now this. Yes, you've got it. Islamic State. Here filmed taking over and looting weapons from an Afghan army base housed in an old NATO fortified compound. Quite some image of where parts of Afghanistan may now be heading. In the east of the country, Islamic State now broadcasts radio programs, news of the caliphate. This all means Afghanistan has never needed a peace process with the insurgents like it needs it now. Tentative talks brokered by Pakistan came to nothing across the summer. There is talk of a new impetus in the new year. Just talk, when so many Afghans crave action and somehow, somewhere, peace and security.
I occasionally come close to letting my emotion overtake me when I'm working. I don't want to be different. I want to be that person who sometimes can feel the choke in his throat. I admire the professionalism of people who never get touched by it. But there are some conversations I can't do. I can't, for example, talk to the widow or the parents of a dead soldier and ask them this question. It just feels too crass. It feels, even though some of them answer yes. I've heard other people and read interviews. Some fathers and mothers would say that their son had died in vain, but I can't do it. I can't look them in the eye or you know, stare them down the microphone and say, did your boy die in vain? Did your boy die for nothing? And yet, I think, actually, that's a massive abnegation of responsibility for the paltry profession that I belong to. It's that journalists are the only people that are ever going to ask that question. Politicians might, but they'll be doing it with a hidden agenda, a subtext, a point to score. The reason journalists who can hold themselves together a little better than I can in some circumstances have to ask this question is that if we don't, then the prospect of more deaths in vain becomes greater. You've got to call it. But it's a horrible conclusion to arrive at. The question I have for you this hour is whether or not it is an irresistible conclusion. If, as seems likely, it's such a mess now that the governor of the region, the deputy governor of the region, took to Facebook earlier this week to plead with the country's president, Ashraf Ghani, to send more forces. He said the whole province was on the verge of falling to the Taliban. The government in Kabul deny that, but who are you going to believe? The deputy governor in the region or the apparently isolated and disinterested government back in the capital? 90 government troops killed in the past few days. If we'd lost the Second World War, if we'd lost it, no one would say, would they, that the soldiers who died from our side in trying to win it had died in vain, would they? I don't think that that's a controversial observation. So if we'd any war we lost, you wouldn't say we shouldn't have fought it, would you? I mean, you fight because you think it's right as a country, maybe not as an actual soldier. As a soldier you fight because you've been told to. But as a country, a political decision is made because we think it is the right thing to do. Doesn't mean everybody does. You're never going to get unanimity on anything like this. But it's why we're bombing Syria at the moment, because the government has decided that it's the right thing to do. Even if you think it's the wrong thing to do, there's part of you that wants to be wrong. You'd hate the idea of people dying and then being proved right that it shouldn't have happened. But that is pretty much what's happened in Iraq, and I wonder if that's what's happened in Afghanistan as well. How do we square it morally? If you've got a link to the armed forces, you've served me very well in the last couple of phone-ins we've done. We did one last week, and we spoke yesterday about women in the army, and it was Marine A last week and his continuing suffering at the hands of the British justice system. And yesterday it was women on the front line, and people with a boot, if you like, in the military camp always have more powerful things to say about military-related issues. But I wonder whether this is one where those of us on Civvy Street have a responsibility to wrestle with the difficult question. Soldiers just deal with it. And if you did a tour in Afghanistan and you can answer this question, I'd love to know how you personally deal with the suspicion or the sense that it was all for nothing. Does it matter? I mean, as a soldier, do you have to just park thoughts like that and remember that Tennyson line from the Charge of the Light Brigade? Ours is not to reason why, ours is just to do and die. James, I can't be messing about worrying about the moral repercussions or the rights and the wrongs of it. My job is to do what Queen and Country tells me to do. So, yeah, all right, now, looking back, I don't think we should have been there. But our men didn't die in vain because... Give me that sentence. I'd really, really be grateful to you. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. It would seem that the part of Afghanistan where more British blood was spilt than anywhere else is about to return to the control of the enemy that spilt it. How do we, as supporters of our soldiers, not necessarily supporters of the war, but how do we, as supporters of our soldiers, persuade ourselves, convince ourselves, persuade each other that these men and women did not die for nothing? More than 100 just in that one province. If it returns to Taliban control, I mean, do we have to just conclude that they died for nothing? There you go. I was resisting asking you that question because it's so uncomfortable, but that's it. It's out there. Did they die for nothing? If the Taliban take over again, did we send those men to die for nothing? 0345 6060 973. And you, much as it pains me to say this, you are allowed, obviously, to answer yes to that question. And by 12 o'clock today, maybe we all will have to answer yes to that question. But right now, at 10 minutes after the hour, I truly do not want to. I am wriggling and writhing and searching for a way in which we can say, okay, so maybe the Taliban's back in control, but that doesn't mean the British soldiers died for nothing. That's what I want from you this hour. I don't know if you're going to be able to provide it. I think we'd all want that, wouldn't we? Nobody really wants to conclude that we sent men and women to die on foreign fields for nothing. Nobody wants to conclude that. You'd have to be the worst kind of stop the war extremist to actually welcome the notion of British deaths because it proves you were right to oppose the war. So how can we find a way in which maybe we need a better understanding? Maybe it's just the bleatings of Civvy Street that you're hearing from me now, the hand-wringing and the overthinking that is one of the rights and privileges that are protected for us by soldiers who will lay down their lives without going through the machinations and ruminations that we're going through now. Maybe that's it. Maybe the answer to the question is very, very simply, James, don't you worry, mate. The soldiers will deal with what the soldiers deal with, and you can carry on wringing your hands and pulling your hair out back in peacetime Britain. But I doubt it, personally. I think there probably is a little bit more to it than this. I think we probably all would like to find a way in which we could say they didn't die for nothing. So, if they didn't die for nothing, what did they die for? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. If they didn't die for nothing, what did they die for? The territory they were defending, poised to return to Taliban hands. Okay? That's the crucial point. That's why we're having this horrible conversation. The territory they died defending is poised to return to Taliban hands. I am desperate to avoid the conclusion that they didn't die, or to avoid the conclusion that they died for, quotes, nothing. But the only way we can do that is if we can work out what they died for. Is it enough to say they died for us? I don't think it is. But I'll be extremely grateful to you if you can persuade me that I'm wrong. 0345 6060 973. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. And don't hold back on this one, because we're all complicit in a way. Even if you were opposed to the war, we didn't vote on Afghanistan, did we? But even if you were opposed to it, we're all complicit. When a soldier takes an oath to Queen and Country, we are the country. That is us. We have a responsibility to ask questions like this precisely because they can't ask these questions themselves. So if they didn't die for nothing, as the Taliban besieges Sangin and looks poised to take over the whole of the province, the men and women, the British soldiers who died defending it, what did they die for? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Don't forget, you can tweet at Mr. James OB and you can text 84850. I hate this. And Tunde's already piled in on Twitter to say this is the question of the 21st century. Surely, James, do our British troops die in vain? I mean, there won't be any casualties yet in Syria for British troops. But there will be, probably, as the situation escalates. I've said to you before, with a very, very heavy heart, we seem to have learned absolutely nothing from our engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq as we pile into Syria. You reckon we're safer now because we took on the Taliban in Afghanistan? You reckon we're safer because we took out Saddam Hussein in Iraq? It's ludicrous wars undertaken as a vanity project by George W. Bush and Tony Blair, decided long before they'd even begun to examine the justification for it. Look at the Wesley Clark stuff, General Wesley Clark stuff on YouTube. And I mention that because he's a former NATO commander, not because he's some conspiracy theorist with a blog. Absolutely clear that they undertook those wars for completely bogus and personal reasons. So do we have to conclude that the soldiers then died for nothing? Aaron's in Stanmore. Aaron, you can kick us off on this. What did they die for?
Yeah, good morning, mate. I just wanted to say very, very happy to be on the radio, first-time caller.
It's great to have you here, Aaron. It's an interesting subject you've picked to make your debut.
Yeah, no, it is. Myself being a former soldier, Australian soldier, that is, if you haven't been able to tell, I think my views is simply we didn't die in vain. I had friends on my tour in 2010. My unit had the most losses for the ADF. We lost 10 members on my 9-month tour. And but the reason why we were there, mate, is simply we were there as a reconstruction task force, as a mentoring task force, which basically stipulated that we went out into the community, we wanted to build schools, we wanted to build housing and running water and all that and provide all that. I think that we've done that. Now, and 5 years after that, we've obviously gone and we've managed to build that reputation, both, US, UK and Australian troops and everyone else, coalition. I don't think we have died in vain, to be honest. I'm quite proud of my service.
You put me in an impossible position. I'm not going to argue with you, am I? I'm not going to tell you shouldn't be proud of your service. That would make me a cad, a heel of the First Order. But if the Taliban takes over, as it looks set to do, then... Oh, mate, you've put me in a right spot now, but I'm going to say it out.
It's good.
It is good, and it's important to have these conversations. Just wish someone else was about to say what I'm about to say. If the Taliban take over, then all the good work you've just described ends up in their hands. You've done it for them.
No, I know, but I do think it is a responsibility from the coalition forces, be it the US, the UK, French, whomever is in the country. I think we have an obligation to help out. Maybe not take a combat role, but as a mentoring task force. I think that if we started it, we should finish it. Personally, I think we've done a good job up until now. Obviously, with the insurgency coming through, they are obviously gaining footholds in certain provinces, and that is bad. Obviously, we've left and the Taliban have gotten strength. But I think that the work that we've done to date. I believe that we had achieved a solid mission. There are political, people in politics and all that will obviously say that was a mistake and we shouldn't have gone to war and all that. But I think on the ground and the benefits that, like the little children that I've seen, the smiles on their faces, having a school that we built.
This is why I keep coming back. This is why I keep coming back to the return. If the Taliban take over again, then all of those advances disappear. These are the people that shot the little girl Malala for the crime of wanting to be educated. I know that was the Pakistani Taliban, but it's the same umbrella.
It is, because Taliban are both in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But I understand that if we do lose it, it is unfortunate. But I don't think the inclusion of British forces within the government, within Afghanistan is not necessarily a bad step. But I don't think boots on ground as a... No, well, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? Learning from mistakes is the only silver lining to making mistakes in the first place. Aaron, thank you for being gentle with me, mate. I sense you could probably have come in a little bit stronger, not least because of your 9 fallen comrades. But I do honestly wonder whether the fact that people like me feel so reluctant to have these conversations is part of the reason why we carry on doing it. Actually, we carry on saying that, we've done it again now. We're going into Syria. Because it is so hard to say we shouldn't have done that and the people who died shouldn't have died and we let them down and they died in vain.
The battleground that claimed the lives of more than 100 British soldiers seems set to fall back into enemy hands, the Taliban. It's a very broad church, the Taliban. It's tempting, isn't it, in the West to think that we know what it means. We don't really. Some of them will be Islamist fundamentalists, but they're sort of fellow travellers, really. Mostly the Taliban and its precursor in the Mujahideen are just sort of separatists, really. They just want to be left alone to carry on growing their opium or running their little cabals. And then we wade in, try and impose democracy. They fight back. We spend 4 years holding this corner of the Hindu Kush, and then, I don't know if it is the Hindu Kush, I shouldn't use those phrases glibly, and then 5 years after we pull out, the Taliban looks set to be back in charge. I guess I'm wondering what we can say about the men and women that died that doesn't sound like saying that they died in vain. 22 after 11. Paul's in Cromer. Paul, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning to you, sir. Thanks very much for having me on the show.
You're very welcome.
I served a number of years over Afghanistan, 6 years in total. The first time I went there was in 2003, and my final tour across there was in 2012. First time I went across there, I was a section commander in charge of 8 guys. My final time when I went across there, I was a platoon sergeant. I was in charge of 24 guys. Now, I am really, really frustrated just listening to this conversation going on right now, and to even suggest that our soldiers, our fighting men and our fighting women died for nothing absolutely brings me to boiling point. These guys, and there was guys on my platoon, personal friends of mine that's died in that country across there. We didn't go across with any sort of political aims. We didn't go across with any feelings of queen and country and all this sort of thing. We went across there to fight for each other. We went across there to that's why these guys died. That's why these people died. They fought for each other. I am so frustrated at the fact that anybody would think that we went to that country for nothing. A personal friend of mine, Sergeant Craig Brailsford, who died in action across there, and posthumously he was awarded the MC, the Military Cross. He went into line of fire. He was injured. He was mortally injured, and he went into the line of fire 3 times to bring casualties back. Them casualties are now around today. Them guys are still walking today. Is anybody going to die for nothing?
That's a thing of beauty what you've just said, because it gives that insight that perhaps you can't have unless you've been there, or at least you have to listen to someone who's been there, of course. And you mentioned the specific circumstances of that sergeant's sacrifice, and it's easy to see that he didn't die for nothing. He died for the people that he saved. He gave his life to protect his comrades, and I completely understand your frustration at this conversation. I share it. I wish I however feel it has to be held, because how do we stop more British soldiers being sent to fight? Not every war is necessary, and not every decision to go to war is correct. And if we don't remember that some people have died in wars that we probably shouldn't have been fighting, we're more likely to fight more that we shouldn't fight in the future, aren't we? We're more likely to do it again.
Regardless what happens, the politicians make some decisions and we just go and fight the war.
You do, but the rest of us don't. The rest of us hold politicians to account. Journalists and members of the public have to reserve the right to tell politicians that they're wrong. And I wonder how uncomfortable you are with the notion that some of these deaths in Afghanistan should and could and will be used to tell politicians that they were wrong to send them in the first place.
That is not mine to question.
Well, I'd like you to. I know. As a soldier, you don't. But I'd like you to now.
Do I think we should have been there?
Yeah.
Yeah, we should have. Absolutely. Yeah, most definitely. There was people across there. There was a Taliban, like you've mentioned before, the Mujahideen before them, and they were committing the most awful.
But we were on their side when they were fighting against the Russians.
Of course we were, and we all make mistakes. The British government made mistakes, didn't they?
Right. Yes.
They made a massive mistake there. Now, when I went across there, I think it was in 2003, I was a part of a team called the Afghan National Army Training Team, and we were teaching the Afghan National Army, who were just a newly formed army at that particular time. They were nothing more than a militia created from the Northern Alliance. We were teaching them how to fight the Taliban, and they took the fight really to them, and they really take the fight to them. I've seen these guys in action, and And these guys really believe in what they're doing, and they're absolutely fearless in the face of the enemy. They really are.
But they're losing now, and the collapse in the last 12 months has apparently been spectacular. It recognises what you've just described. The fighting force we left behind was efficient, was well trained, was engaged. But now you got the deputy governor saying that the whole of Helmand is going to fall any minute now. And if the whole of Helmand falls, what does it say to the families of your dead comrades if the land they died defending falls into the hands of the enemy?
I know some of the parents of these guys that have died, and they feel exactly the way that I do, that they died for their fighting brothers and sisters, and it is. And I'm sorry I can't elaborate on this.
No, I don't want you to elaborate. I don't think you should. I don't think you need to. I think you do your fallen comrades proud by simply reminding those of us over here examining the broader political issues and the bigger landscape, if you like, of consent and war, that for you there, then, it's got nothing to do with anything more than being there then. It is just about that moment, that day, that comrade, that colleague. However, I do, and I'm more than happy to be told that I'm wrong about this. I do think it's important for the rest of us to have these conversations. 27 after 11. Paul, thank you, mate. I really appreciate you taking the time to call in. I look forward to talking to you again, hopefully perhaps on a less traumatic issue. Simon is in Hayes in Middlesex. Simon, what made you pick up the phone?
Good morning, James.
Yeah.
From my perspective, my son served out in Sangin in the summer of 2010 as a Royal Marine Commando in a very bloody tour, as it happens. They lost 14 men during those 6 months, and as well as obviously several wounded, certainly one triple amputee. You can imagine it was a very, very stressful time for me and my family.
Yes.
And I suppose, looking from my point of view, I felt I had to justify it in some way why they were out there. And my thoughts on it were that in 2007 we were subject to, obviously in London, to bombing attacks.
Yes.
And all these, if not all of them, certainly most of the bombers of that time had gone out to Afghanistan, although I think they travelled to Pakistan, but it was said or thought that they'd actually trained in Afghanistan.
And the presence of Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan at that time is unquestioned.
Yes, absolutely. And so I felt that it was like he was taking, or the British forces were taking the fight to them.
Yes.
To their training place, which to me seemed, it's to stop them coming over here and doing their mischief over here, to stop them training out there. Now, I know we are still today under as big a threat as ever.
Or bigger, arguably.
Well, exactly, certainly bigger. However, as far as I know, I stand to be corrected on this, they're not training out in Afghanistan anymore. We by going out there, we took the fight to Al-Qaeda, effectively, who was being supported by the Taliban, and made them very busy over there so that they didn't send them the people over here, or people weren't going to Afghanistan necessarily. After a while, we'd been there, they weren't going to Afghanistan from here to train and come back.
And the fact that they might now go to Syria instead doesn't dilute your...
Well, I felt that at that time, again, things change.
Yeah,
as you say. I mean, it's very much a situation. It's rather like I used to be a police officer. I'm retired now. I used to be a police officer, and you blitzed a certain area that was being hard hit with burglaries, and the burglars moved elsewhere, and you had to just keep.
Yes, and to argue that you shouldn't have blitzed the area in the first place would be ridiculous. It would be absurd.
Exactly. Yes. That was my take on it, anyway.
And that was a comfort to you, I imagine.
Not so much comfort. It's rather weird. I mean, I was so obviously very thankful my son came home uninjured.
Yes.
So, obviously you can imagine day by day the sort of life we were having.
I'm not sure I can actually, Simon. I'm not sure I can.
But to me, I felt that had the worst happened, and of course this is going through your head all the time, had the worst happened, I felt he had been doing, as well as fighting for his mates and, and being a part of one of the best forces in the world, he had actually been there doing a good job and doing his job and doing something that was worthwhile.
And taking out those training camps and removing that conveyor belt of hate and terror, if you like. I can see that, and I can see why, and I can concur. Thank you so much for calling. I feel a bit inadequate. Doesn't happen to me very often, but it always happens when we have conversations about this issue. Father of a soldier, Paul there in Cromer, talking about leaving his comrades on the field. It just makes you feel tiny. It really does. But you have to ask these questions. Otherwise, you let them all down. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, asking what ranks among the most difficult and the most reluctantly asked questions that we'll ever address together. And I just a quick word of thanks to everybody who's been in touch to effectively express understanding of why we do it and why we have these conversations, including people like Simon, whose son did a particularly bloody tour in Afghanistan, and Paul, who went out there more than once and left dead comrades in Afghanistan. And I'm getting closer now. I don't know about you, but I'm getting closer to the notion that you can make sense of those sacrifices and those deaths in a way that is not in any way diluted or polluted by the knowledge today that the land they were defending is poised to return to the hands of the enemy. Although, obviously, there's plenty of people who would disagree with that conclusion. Gordon writes, no, they didn't die for nothing, James. Principles outlive results. If we'd won World War II, then Poland was re-invaded. Those that had fallen did not die for nothing. We would have re-engaged the Nazis. Amir takes a rather more sceptical view. Of course they didn't die for nothing, James. We sold a whole bunch of arms and security contracts. Tony Blair got a job as the Middle East peace envoy. We installed the former Unocal oil chief Hamid Karzai as leader of the Afghan government. A few people and a few companies became extraordinarily rich, and in a few years we'll do it all again. Merry Christmas. Michael writes, of course those soldiers died in vain. It's amazing how many of these emails begin with the words of course and then say completely opposing and contrary things. They were cannon fodder, just as soldiers have always been, because we continue to fail to learn the lessons of war. Remarkably broad a spectrum of opinion on this. Steve writes, we have not learned from history. No great power has ever pacified Afghanistan, Alexander the Great included. You're right. Of course you're right, Steve, but destroying the Al-Qaeda training camps was the goal. Arguably, pacifying Afghanistan never was. He goes on, we were doomed to fail and have wasted blood and treasure trying where the Soviet Union with 1 million soldiers and no worries about human rights couldn't succeed. Such a shame for the brave men and women who died for political vanity. Massive respect for all our armed forces, because it is not their choice where or who they fight. So if you are just joining us, the question began and remains, reluctant though I am to ask it in such bold terms, if the Taliban retakes Helmand province, if the Taliban retakes Sangin, where over a quarter of British deaths were suffered, what does it do to those deaths? Does it make them pointless? Does it mean they died in vain? On a personal level, never. I think we can thank Paul in Cromer for that. On a personal level, they will never feel that it was in vain. The survivors will never feel that their colleagues died in vain, because they died in the crucible of war. But if they shouldn't have been in that crucible in the first place, those of us on the outside, how do we make sense of it? How do we cling to the notion that it was a noble sacrifice as opposed to a pointless one? 0345 6060 973. Very busy first half an hour, but if you hit the numbers now, you will get through, I promise. You have to be quick, but you will. Jack's in Leeds. Jack, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Jack.
I was speaking to your producer. She was... Well, my opinion is that I don't think these men have died, or women have died in vain at all. I think it's really quite crass to say that. I think you've got to look at what was produced, other than killing Taliban members and destroying training camps. It's the hearts and minds of the people of Afghanistan. And there will be a lot of people who disagree with why ISAF were there in the first place. But, it's the schools that they built, it's the infrastructure that they built.
But that's all worthless if the Taliban push back. That's all worthless, isn't it? I mean,
no, you're right. If it's destroyed, you've got a point. However, the point I'm making is that these kids, these young adults, whoever it was, this generation who saw ISAF and saw the goodness in what the West was trying to do, have an idea of what could be done.
And you could bring Malala into the conversation, albeit she was on the other side of the Pakistani border. The values that we perhaps somewhat patronisingly sometimes, congratulate ourselves on holding the superior moral framework that we try to adhere to, she recognised and saw, and that's what empowered her to stand up to the Taliban that shot her.
Absolutely. She realised that outside this oppressive regime, there was a kind of government, a kind of form of governance, which is what the West embodies. The thing is, you've got to look at it this way. You know, the West, Britain, it's a government that's been in power for 850 years, or say a form of governance that's been in power for 850 years without being taken over by anyone else. You know, we have seen it, we've done it, we've broken the human rights laws, we've been all over the world, we've killed, we've done slave trade, we've learned the lessons, and we've come back, and maybe we have learned from the mistakes, and maybe we're trying to help our neighbours in the world not make these mistakes.
It's quite a noble position that it's quite a noble picture that you paint. Some people paint the polar opposite of it. Some people paint the polar opposite of it, about us, you know, essentially helping ourselves to various resources, indulging in various, you know, military contracts, and doing it really for reasons that don't bear any resemblance at all to what you've just described.
No, I'm bringing it down to the man on the ground, the person whose son died in an IED attack.
Yes.
But Blair and Bush, they went to war on completely the wrong ideals. You know, we all know that. I mean, history will write that.
Well, hang on, not unless Lord Chilcot gets his finger out.
Right. Well, well, eventually we might find out.
Yeah, one day.
One day. But the point I'm making is these blokes who went to war with the best intentions, they went to try and liberate the people of Afghanistan. And a lot of them will have gone to avenge innocent deaths in our country as well. Why is a person's life in Great Britain worth less than a person's life in Afghanistan? You know, there is collateral damage in war. The collateral damage on our side, you could say, was the 7/7 attacks, was that bloke on the tube the other day who stabbed somebody. You know, that's the collateral damage on our side. Why are our lives not important? Is it because we live in a Western society where the economy is better? You know,
I think it's just proximity, isn't it? It's proximity and familiarity, I think. Just answer this for me very briefly, Jack. Simon's tweeted to say, you won't do soldiers any favour by justifying and as a result perpetuating pointless conflict. Now, I know you're probably going to repeat yourself a bit, but you're arguing very persuasively that it wasn't pointless at all.
I don't think any war against evil is ever unjustified or wrong. I think sometimes the what happens in war is always wrong. I think
who gets to decide what's evil?
I think there's a clear. There's a clear moral code.
Really? Because the people that you're talking about wouldn't describe themselves as evil.
In what regard? You're talking about we're not talking about ISAF soldiers. We're talking about Taliban fighters.
Or even ISIL. Yeah. I mean, we might think they're evil, but they don't think they're evil. Who gets to decide they're evil?
We'll break it down. Let's break it down even further than that. You know, let's look at the ISAF fighter who's just trying to make. The Afghanistan fighter who's just trying to make a living, and he's being paid by the Taliban to fight. He's doing what he's told to do. He's a man on the ground. He's a soldier. But if we break it down to governments, then you know we can talk all day about how wrong war is. It is wrong. You know, it's not ideal. But when you go somewhere with the best intentions, and ultimately the last part of the Afghanistan war was a rebuilding project. It was keeping the Taliban at bay. It was allowing these people to live normal lives, to open their markets.
You're right, aren't you? Of course you're right. And also the timing. What if it was 20 years down the line or 50 years down the line that the retrenchment happened, that the Taliban? I mean, would I still sit here asking the same question? I'd sound like even more of an idiot than I do already. Jack, thank you. Although every time I find a little nugget of confidence to cling to, someone else will come along to kick it away. Phil's texted to say the Second World War did not negate the terrible losses of the First World War, and so the return of the Taliban to Helmand will not negate the losses and sacrifices made there only recently. Wars are fought in the now. That's a reiteration of that point. But I tell you what I learned yesterday. There was one of the French generals involved in the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War. I think his name, and you'll pull me up on this, I'm sure, I think his name was Hoche. There's all those avenues that lead to the Place de l'Étoile in Paris. There's the Champs-Élysées, and then they're named after three French generals. I think one of them was called Hoche. And he said, at Versailles in 1918, this is not a peace treaty, this is a 20-year ceasefire. How prescient that turned out to be, almost to the month. So again, although I like to draw from Phil's parallels with the First and Second World War, you could argue, actually, that the lessons of the First World War were not learned, and that's why the Second World War happened. Greg's in. I'll come to Greg first after the travel news. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Coming up after 12, one of the subjects that we've discussed the most this year together, and we're heading towards our last show of the year together, today is the penultimate one, involves the paedophile abuse undertaken by various VIPs. Some of it still merely alleged, some of it established. Greville Janner, of course, who passed away at the weekend, key among some of those conversations historically. He is dead now, and yet the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, is contemplating continuing with the so-called trial of the facts. Some persuasive commentary in the newspapers today, but to me, saying that it shouldn't happen, Dan Hodges in the Telegraph, even death will not spare Janner from justice, in quotes. At what point do we stop and say enough and admit that our paedophile psychosis has gone too far? I mean, words I find quite chilling, really. I'm not sure you can ever go too far in the pursuit of paedophiles, or certainly in the pursuit of justice and some semblance of closure for their victims. I'm not quite sure what too far would look like. But if you can have a trial of the facts with a man whose brain is essentially, I don't want to use the word dead, but whose brain is not sufficiently active to actually constitute proper presence in court, what's the difference between having a trial of the facts with a man who's no longer compos mentis in the metaphorical dock and a man who's no longer alive in the metaphorical dock? I suppose what I'm saying is I think they should crack on with the trial of the facts for the sake of the victims, the sake of the accusers, but I'm not sure after 12 o'clock today I'll be able to hold that up to your scrutiny. Stick around and find out.
James O'Brien, weekdays 10 till 1 on LBC.
It's 12 minutes to 12. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question remains, if, as seems inevitable, Taliban returns to primacy in Helmand province in Afghanistan, what does that do to the deaths of over 100 British soldiers? Soldiers who died defending that province. And the answers have been, I don't know if happier is quite the right word, but more uplifting than I dared to hope at 11 o'clock this morning. Thank you once again for that. Still, of course, far from complete, this conversation, and in many ways it never will be. 0345 6060973 is the number you need if you would like to join in. And again, we've heard from people that were there, people who were commanding troops that sustained casualties and deaths, fathers. We've heard from Simon, very powerful caller, talking about his boy being there and how he made sense of the situation. And I want to be even further into their camp than I currently am, but of course, for every very, very powerful account of why we shouldn't even contemplate the notion that these men and women might have died in vain, there are powerful arguments that push you back in the other direction. 0345 6060973. Greg is in Brentwood. Greg, what would you like to say?
Yeah, actually, it's really been interesting hearing the whole topic, because it's actually been something.
Producer and I were just saying that during the travel news, Greg.
Oh, really? Because you see, I've always been a bit of, just by nature, a very kind of like, I wouldn't say anti-government, more anti-war, not the anti-war movement side of it as such. But I've often wondered, like, when you think back to the fake weapons of mass destruction and all of the, hundreds of thousands of lives, if you take the civilian casualties into account as well, how, when you find out that it was all built on a lie, how on earth, as a military person, you'd be able to kind of cope with the knowledge, knowing that you were sent out there. But then I was quite interested, because I thought that's a really nice angle. You had a caller on who was talking about the fact, well, actually, they didn't die in vain because they were working to save their colleagues and their comrades.
That was Pauline Cromer, former sergeant. Yeah, it was. It stopped me in my tracks, that as well.
Yeah, I thought that was great, because for me, as being a big war skeptic, even the current goings-ons, we've got like with Syria and obviously now with like Afghanistan again, you start thinking like, my God, well, I just could not ever, you think back to the generations that stood up, went to war on their government say-so, with World War I, World War II, and the millions that were lost there. I just don't think I could have that in me to be able to stand up and go on blind faith and trust the government. I mean, it must be so hard for them.
Well, there are, I don't want to complicate the conversation, but I think there are reasons why patriotism is often used by some deeply questionable people as a stick with which I don't think we would send our sons and daughters to die if we properly examined what patriotism really means and what nationalism really means. But you get that sniff in your nostrils, and that's what leads people to join up and to go, because there is a sense of loyalty to a flag. You go and spill your blood for a flag. Second World War, no question at all. That was a battle between good and evil. Pretty much every other war in history probably doesn't lend itself to such neat analysis, does it? What the hell were we doing at Agincourt?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, although I have to admit you're straying into slightly more historical territory than I'm comfortable commenting on. But
that's just because you're worried about sounding like you don't know what you're talking about. I'm never worried by that, Greg. I've been doing it for years. Still cashing the checks.
I listen to the show every day.
You're very all right. Carry on. Thank you, Greg. It's 11:52. You're listening to LBC. A few of you pointing out Marine A was doing what he did in precisely this theatre of war, and the notion that he continues to fester in jail is absurd. I actually do agree with you, but not necessarily for the reasons that you suggest. And I knew I'd make a mistake. It wasn't Hoch, it was Foch. It was Marshal Foch, who was head of all the Allied armies towards the end of the First World War. You can see a statue of him, I'm told, in this anonymous email in front of Victoria Station. The bloke I referred to, who there is also an avenue named after, was called Hoche, and that was during the French Revolution. I was only out by about 200 years and one consonant. It was Foch was the bloke who said that the Treaty of Versailles was a 20-year ceasefire rather than an actual peace deal. And this emailer goes on, much as I love Pete Seeger's When Will They Ever Learn, World War II was not because they hadn't learnt the lesson of World War I. It was the second act of the same war. What Foch meant was that the war was not finished and would therefore resume. The West fighting the Taliban, likewise, was an unfinished war. Astonishing quality of contributor today, and there's still time for you to join their ranks. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. How do you make sense of sacrifices made in a battle when the enemy subsequently and quite quickly afterwards retakes the territory that these men and women died defending? It is, I think, as the last caller pointed out, easier now to grasp than it was before Paul in Cromer rang in, because if you're there, if you're on the battlefield, you don't indulge in these contemplations and ruminations. If you're there on the battlefield, you are acting solely and exclusively in the interests of your colleagues and your comrades. So I can see now how you could come back and whatever happened subsequently, whatever happened next, whatever happened afterwards, you would never feel that your comrades, your colleagues had died. I hate the phrase, which we've been using from the outset, the phrase in vain. However, with 5 minutes left on this, if you want to ring in and start pushing us back in the opposite direction, I think it would probably be helpful. Otherwise we do fall foul, or at least leave ourselves slightly vulnerable to that kind of dewy-eyed, flag-saluting reverence that many of us feel when we're discussing military matters. It does demand a slightly more cold analysis, perhaps, if we're to do proper service to the question that we are asking. And I'll return to a few other things that have come in via text and email. Dahlia reminds us, I had not been told where my son had been sent to in Afghanistan. He couldn't wait to go, so I covered my tears and told myself it was as safe as it could be. Please remind people, James, as you have this conversation, that you can send army care packages to our troops out there, a shoebox size, less than 2 kilos. Fill it with Garmin sweets and telephone cards and treats, even small boxes for the dogs that are out there as well. It's free to send. Just Google it for information. Dahlia, I'm very happy to remind people of that, and I'm grateful to you for reminding me. 11:55 is the time. I just sort of contemplating the question of how you move on, as it were, from the knowledge that you died defending territory that has been retaken by the people you were fighting against. And we've done, I think, together a pretty impressive job. You can continue to do it, or you can continue to help me do it by dialing in. You were out by 130 years, James, not 200, points out Andrew. There's always one. Ash is in Tottenham. Ash, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello?
Ash, hello. You're on LBC. What would you like to say?
Yeah, I just think it is a really touchy subject. It is a delicate subject. But I feel like the bigger question needs to be asked, and it is a much bigger question of why it's happening. Why is the war happening? Why is the troops out there? And I feel like that in itself it kind of answers all these questions, which is it's business. It is business, and as much as people don't want to admit it, people are sent to die to make. It's about power and it is about money. It's about money.
In the context of Iraq, I think that would be easier to sustain. You're not persuaded by the Al-Qaeda training camps and the need to shut them down?
Well, no. I mean, if you...
I thought that was fairly uncontroversial.
No, I mean, the Taliban comes from the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen itself...
and they were giving shelter to Al-Qaeda, and Osama bin Laden was there.
No, I understand, but if you look at, for example, if I told you about a threat that someone's going to attack us, but you find out that I'm the person that's put that person in place and also funded him and trained him to attack, I feel like that's a very valid point that always gets overlooked. That is a fundamental point, and it's happening now. It's something that we haven't learned, is that, you fund an extremist group to help you against the Russians during that time.
No, sorry, I misunderstood you. We have, I take your point. We have covered that territory, the escalation of the Mujahideen into the Taliban, but it doesn't really answer the question of what we've been talking about today. And I think the Al-Qaeda angle does slightly undermine the notion that the battle in Afghanistan was something that fits the parameters you've just described. The Al-Qaeda training camps were there. All right, there was also a military-industrial subtext to the decision to go in, and Bush and Blair went in for reasons that were a lot more opaque than anything to do with Al-Qaeda allows. But I can't let you get away with sort of overlooking or dismissing the Al-Qaeda angle. I'm too short a time. Tariq, you've got about a minute in Mill Hill. Can you use it, or is it not enough?
Well, okay, all I can say is we're an 8-hour flight from Afghanistan.
God, yeah.
Whereas the country next door is living with the Taliban's evil behavior on a daily basis.
Pakistan.
Now, yes, that's Pakistan. Now, if we have a look at those 100 kids who were killed, okay, they were killed. Why? Because they were the children of the Pakistani army.
You mean at the school in Peshawar?
Yes, that's right. Now, the thing is, I think if the British Army probably didn't go in now or before, the thing could have been far, far worse, because the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have shown that they have hijacked the religion of Islam. They do not represent Islam at all. I'm a Pakistani. I was born in Pakistan, but I'm a British Muslim now. And it saddens me. It really seriously saddens me to see these miserable people, the way they carry out their attacks. They hijack people, innocent people, to fund their illegal...
And how much worse would things have been if we hadn't done what we did? That, Tariq, is a really lovely point at which to end this difficult conversation. I'm very grateful to you for providing it.